Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to All Era Sports with Sirhan, coming to you live on this 12th of February 2026. As I come to you live from Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States of America. Here's hoping everyone had themselves a wonderful day today and a wonderful past couple days. It is Valentine's Day coming up. Serious hoping everyone is going to have themselves a nice Valentine's Day, Valentine's weekend. Hoping everyone is having themselves a wonderful day. Tonight is a historical night for one simple purpose and one simple purpose only. It's to touch on one of the giant little big men rivalries the sport boxing has ever saw. And that's what we had, which took place in the second of this four-fight series 75 years ago tonight in New York City. We talk about some of the little big men, the big men rivalries. They're a case of ones that don't have the exciting power like the big men, but do bring thrilling action, and they lay it all on the table for every chance they get, and that's what we had. We talk about what took place on this night 40-plus years ago, 75 years ago, and these two had a rivalry that tested boundaries, towed the line in terms of the rules, and it turned out to be more than what we bargained for, and that's what we had 75 years ago tonight. It was the second of the four-fight series between Willie Pep and Sandy Saddler, and a fight that saw both Pep and Saddler just do what they can to toe the line, do what they can to manipulate the rules, and as a result, we had just one of the crazy rivalries of its time, especially south of the middleweight division, which I'll touch on that at the end. But when we talk about these two guys, and they say styles are made for one another, that's what you had with Pep and Saddler. And we talk about Pep and Saddler, they certainly were. The will-o'-the-wisp Willie Pep, the pure boxer of his time, known for defense and maneuverability, the ability to control the ring, which he's always done, against the rugged, aggressive, and tough Sandy Saddler, probably one of the 5 premier punchers in the history of the featherweight division. And that's what you had with this particular rivalry. And this second fight that took place 76 years ago tonight at New York City was a rematch of what took place about 4.5 months earlier, where Sandy Saddler stunned the world by knocking out the all-time great Willie Pep to win the featherweight championship. And a lot of people point to a lot of reasons for it, mainly because after an airplane crash that had Willie Pep suffering injuries after an airplane crash, it was rumored to be on the party lifestyle at that point when he hit his pedestal. So Saddler took advantage of it and won the 9th round stoppage. And shortly thereafter, after a couple wins apiece, we had the second fight between Willie Pep and Sandy Saddler. We talk about Willie Pep. We touch on here in a minute. Willie Pep, the will-o'-the-wisp, one of the all-time great defensive fighters, one of the all-time great slicksters, boxers of all time, you even recall it. At a time today when nobody's appreciative of it, for his time, few of any appreciated what Willie Pep brought to the table, and that's what we had. We talk about the career of the great Willie Pep. I mean, born in Middletown, Connecticut, it had a multicultural background. You talk about a fighter who boxed over 200 plus, over almost 2,000 plus rounds in his career, over 200 plus fights, and ascended to arguably at that point, at that time, a distinction of the greatest pound for pound fighter maybe ever. Remember, this is before we were introduced to other guys like Sugar Ray Robinson, among others. But Willie Pep, you could say, arguably had the distinction of the greatest featherweight of all time. And he said it to this point when he won the world featherweight title from Chalky Wright back in 1942, to 7 years before this. It just kept trucking on, made a few successful title defenses, which included a win over Wright in a rematch. And then we come forward to what took place 6 months before the rematch. We talk about the first fight with Sandy Saddler, and a fight where Saddler just roughed him up pretty good, not let Willie Pep dictate the ring, and that's why we talk about Pep versus Sandler. Now we talk about the career of Sandy Saddler going into this fight. One of the more brutal punchers in those weight classes at a time when it was more about style and high volume. Saddler was one of the few who had accuracy and had punch, just unthought of in those weight classes at the time. And he himself put together a massive record of 87-6-2 prior to the first fight against Pep, after when he just starched him in 4 rounds to win the world featherweight title at that point. And after a few fights apiece, it was slated for a rematch to take place 77 years ago at Madison Square Garden. And there was no buildup. It needed to be done because Willie Pep was driven to get his title back. Sandy Saddler wanted to retain it. And after a first fight, which was a lot of roughhousing going on, question was, can Willie Pep suck it up for one last great performance of his illustrious all-time great career? And he had to go to the well simply because Sandy Saddler had the style to make Pep look bad, especially when we talk about how physical Sandy Saddler was. And you never equate little big men with being physical and rough, but that's what Sandy Saddler was back in the 1940s. And after winning the title from Willie Pep, 4.5 months later, we have the rematch of Pep and Sandler. It's a case of, was it a fluke or can Willie Pep put himself together for one last great performance? And that's what we had. We talk about what's going on with this particular fight 77 years ago. And the second fight of this was a case of Willie Pep showing the world why he's Willie Pep, a.k.a. the Will-O-the-Wisp. His style, his defense, his ability to make you miss and make you pay was what made him successful throughout his career. And that was going to have to be his MO going into this rematch, because after what took place in the first fight and everything that happened to Pep after the airplane crash in 1947, you wondered if he can gather it up. And he found a way to do that, especially early on in this fight. We talk about the early rounds of Pep-Saddler 2 at Madison Square Garden. Many believed it was going to be either the real end or he's just going to have that last great performance on a swan song on the way out. Because after Pep-Saddler won, everybody was calling for Pep's career to be done. They were all calling for his head. Because after the airplane accident and getting hammered and beat up by Sandy Saddler, that's why we had this rematch. And that's why the world called for Pep to simply retire. But Willie Pep said, heck with it. I'm going to fight this guy. And they were calling this to be a wipeout for Sandler because Pep was so far past it. Excuse me, wipeout for Sandler because Pep was so far past it. But Willie Pep had other ideas. And we talk about how going into this fight, the only reason why the fight took place was because of a clause in the contract between Willie Pep and the 20th Century Sporting Club. And at that point, people will wonder if it would sell. Well, it turned out to be a hot ticket, one of the highest grossing gates at that time in boxing history, at least south of the more well-publicized weight classes at the time. Now, to remind everybody again, this is the old school 8. There was no supers or juniors weight classes. This was the old school 8. And you had 2 of the premier fighters ever in that weight class clashing at one of the hottest tickets at that time. And that was how the second fight between Willie Pep and Sandy Saddler became, because a fellow named Harry Markson found a way to sell it, and he did a heck of a job selling it because it turned out to be quite a crowd on that night. And at that time, the numbers are different today than it was back in the 1940s. It was an $80,000 grossing gate, which was a big deal back then. I mean, you made it then. You were basically declared rich. That's what it was in 1947 when you talk about Pep and Sandler. So it was a belief that Willie Pep could do this, but after how he was just hammered in 4 rounds of the first fight by Sandler, question was, could he gather it all together for one last great performance? And that's what we had. We talk about a 20,000 plus seat fill-in of the Madison Square Garden, a packed house, a lot of curiosity, a lot of generosity when you consider all the stakes that took place here. And we also consider what was going to get out of Willie Pep after he got hammered by Sandy Saddler. And we talk about how this fight started as we fast forward to the fight. The story early on was this time Willie Pep took it to Sandy Saddler and started to pepper him with lefts and rights, especially in the early rounds. We're talking about, at least there's no CompuBox back then, but it was observed that people thought he landed somewhere over 30 jabs in the first round of that fight in the rematch, which was Willie Pep's bread and butter. And as we talk about some of the other all-time greats, you establish a left jab, you can do things. And when Willie Pep started to get that jab going early against Sandy Saddler, that's what you got. And Pep was starting to look like his old self a little bit. And the hand speed that he was known for and the slickness that he was known for, he brought it back in this second fight. And he was starting to control the pace, especially in the early rounds. And it looked like Pep was building an early lead and had seized control temporarily. But the well-known relentless aggression of the tough and durable Sandy Saddler took over. And even though he was having success coming forward and able to land at times, problem still was the slickness and the quickness of Willie Pep was still giving Sandy Saddler problems, because now Pep was starting to time Sandler's aggressiveness with those left jabs of his, and that's what made him successful in the rematch up to that point. And the ability to counterpunch Sandler was what made Willie Pep one of the better performances of his career at that point, especially on the downturn. We consider after what took place in the first fight where Pep couldn't get anything going. And he basically started to use a ring, counterpunch Sandler effectively, started to get a little rough, which was Sandler's forte. And there were some people out there who thought Willie Pep shouldn't be doing it. But Pep took a page out of Sandler's book and found a way to get a little rough with Sandler while using his natural born gifts, which was his jab, his elusiveness, and his effective counterpunching and defense. And that was why Pep built the early lead. And as Sandler was coming on, and Pep did everything he can to hold him off, the middle round saw Sandy Saddler starting to show why he was one of the brutal punchers of all time, because early in the 5th round, the right cross that knocked out Pep the first time busted up Willie Pep, as now we have Pep starting to get beat up again with his face starting to have cuts and gashes all over the place. And even though Sandler was starting to find success with that right hand and started to make his mark, Willie Pep was going punch for punch with the great Sandy Saddler. And even though Pep was trying to keep Sandler off, Sandler was coming on. But this time, it was Willie Pep who was controlling the tempo of the fight due to his ability to land at will from every angle imaginable. And that's what made him the will-o'-the-wisp. And basically, it's trying to hold off Sandy Saddler, who was essentially going for a knockout, because that was the only way he was going to win these fights. And at that point, it looked like Pep held off the momentum, especially in the middle, around the middle rounds. As you close into the later rounds, Pep looked like he was in control of the fight. But as the fight was going on, the power of Sandler once again took over, and another cut was open, and starting to hit hard punches on Pep. And it looked like we're going to have another knockout for Sandler, like in the first fight. But this time, Willie Pep went to the well and went punch for punch with one of the premier punchers of all time, Sandy Saddler, all busted up and everything. And that was why Willie Pep found the youth a little bit. And as the fights was starting to go on, as the 14th and 15th round was starting to close, after Saddler came out like a ball of fire looking for the knockout because he knew he needed it, Pep weathered the storm, had a big 15th round, and basically buckled down and matched punch for punch with a durable Sandy Saddler. And we conclude the 15-round fight, and it was likely is his most satisfying win at the back end of his career, and probably his last great performance. And you could probably say his greatest performance ever. The will-o'-the-wisp Willie Pep gets his revenge on Sandy Saddler by unanimous decision to regain the World Featherweight Championship and stamp his place in history as one of the premier all-time greats pound for pound. And that's what happened 77 years ago tonight in front of a packed house at Madison Square Garden. And we talk about Willie Pep, the first to regain the title in this weight class ever. His place in history rose, and a lot of people know him for his defensive skills, but he brought a lot to the table. And when we talk about ring generalship in the sport, and we talk about with a lot of guys, for that time, no one had ring generalship quite like Willie Pep, and he had to bring it out because no one did it quite like Willie Pep, but he had to bring it out because Sandy Saddler was coming hard, like he did in their first fight where he knocked him out effortlessly in 4 rounds. And that was why Willie Pep managed to escape with a unanimous decision win. And that performance by Pep spun off to 2 more fights in this Pep-Saddler rivalry. But the story of those 2 was this time in 2 fights where rules were crossed at multiple times. Willie Pep couldn't keep Sandy Saddler off of him, and this led to 2 stoppage victories for Sandy Saddler on both times for him to regain the World Featherweight title. But the one win in this series, we talk about the 3-1 series for Saddler, but the one win for Pep may have arguably been his finest hour and maybe one of his dig deep down into the well performances ever when you consider what Sandy Saddler was able to do to him, and might have been Willie Pep's finest hour and definitely his biggest win after the whole plane crash in 1947, and we started to live a wild lifestyle outside of the ring, which was chronicled at the time. And it got to that point, and whatever he did from that point forward, his career was etched in history. One of the premier little giants who knew the ring as well as anyone, one of the premier defensive fighters, and a top all-time great pound-for-pound fighter. We talk about Willie Pep. I mean, so long, my top 4 will always be Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Joe Louis, and Henry Armstrong. But behind that was Willie Pep because of what he was able to do in the ring. Yes, everyone's going to bring up that particular so-called round he won without throwing a punch, but that was not who Willie Pep was. They call him will-o'-the-wisp for a reason. His ability to make you miss and make you pay, and his ability to use that jab, as he did in this rematch against a relentless oncoming Sandy Saddler, was what made Willie Pep great. And that was why 77 years ago tonight at Madison Square Garden, he was able to find himself back at the top of the mountain in the featherweight division once again. And one of the great stories you could read about when you talk about the great Willie Pep. And after the 4-fight series, Pep never got another title shot, but still managed to fight on, getting some solid wins along the way. Finished with a career record of 229, 11, and 1. And arguably one of the all-time great featherweights. You could probably make a case for the greatest featherweight. I'll touch on that here in a second. But we flip it over to Sandy Saddler. And he managed to get the 2 more wins over Pep, but lost this title eventually because back up here. He didn't lose a title. He just kept going on. Sandy Saddler, to space out his career, hardly defended the title, but a lot of his roughhouse tactics was basically starting to become well chronicled after the Pep fight. But even at that, Sandy Saddler still had the brutal punch. And in those weight classes, back in those days, when you had that punch, you were the king of the crop. And that's why Sandy Saddler was a problem for a lot of fighters, especially Willie Pep. And that's why after the rematch, Saddler got the title back and went on to make many more title defenses to retain his World Featherweight Championships. Another enormous career. We talk about Sandy Saddler, who finished with a record of 145, 16, and 12. Got some solid wins along the way, especially splitting a series with the standout Gabriel Flash Elorde, among many others. And that's where he managed to establish himself, also like Willie Pep, as an all-time great featherweight. In a 4-fight series where it was 3-1 Saddler, but maybe the one win by Pep sort of outdid the 3 wins by Saddler, and I say it for one reason. You talk about Willie Pep's place in history, and nobody talks about it enough. Certainly a top 10 pound for pound. Sometimes on your way out, you need a kind of a performance where you can dig to the well, turn back the hands of time, and show you still had it. And after being written off, after being knocked out by Saddler in the first fight, Willie Pep said, "Give me Saddler again. I'm going to go to the well." And that's what he did. And that's why he managed to regain the World Featherweight title and reestablish and almost escalate his place in boxing history and boxing immortality. We talk about being a top 5 or top 6 all-time great pound-for-pound fighter. And this performance, when he beat Saddler the second time, was needed, especially given after what happened about a little more than a year and a half before with the airplane accident and the lifestyle outside the ring that started to catch up to him. That was why Willie Pep needed the win over Saddler to reestablish his place in history, and it's forever secured, forever immortalized as a top 5 or top 6 all-time great pound for pound. And we're talking all-time great, not just on a generosity, all-time great. He's there with the rest of them. That tells you how great Willie Pep was. Now for the career of Sandy Saddler, as I said, he kept going on, had a terrific career himself, not far behind Pep in the status of the greatest in the history of that weight class, also up there among the all-time great pound for pound. That's what puts him up there among the real all-time greats also. I mean, one of the 100 greatest punchers of all time, as was listed, happens to be the uncle of Grandmaster Flash, you know, the hip-hop artist. And if you look at the photo of Sandy Saddler and put it next to Grandmaster Flash, you can see the resemblances, because that's where they were resembled. And I was not aware of that until I read about the career of the great Sandy Saddler. And you're talking about the second fight with Pep and Saddler. It was a 1949 Ring Magazine Fight of the Year. Certainly a gem. Certainly a case of where Willie Pep was forced to go to the well because Sandy Saddler was bringing it, and Sandy Saddler was beating Willie Pep up. But unlike the previous 3 fights in the series, this time Willie Pep went to the well, matched Saddler punch for punch, utilized his jab, and countered Saddler effectively to walk away with a unanimous decision in a sense of rounds of 10 rounds to 5 in a sense of rounds to win it. And that was why Willie Pep and Sandy Saddler gave us a 1949 Fight of the Year, because both guys went at it at the highest level in the featherweight division. And back in those days, in those weight classes, it wasn't talked about enough at the high levels, but Willie Pep and Sandy Saddler brought it in that 4-fight series and really put it on the map. Says a lot about the greatness of those 2 featherweights. Now we talk about some of the great lighter rivalries in those weight classes. I'm talking south of the middleweight division. Before I do that, let's put this rivalry in its context. We talk about Willie Pep and Sandy Saddler, because at times it was contentious, it was intense, and it was edgy. When you talk about Pep and Saddler, because they towed the line when they met in the ring with some of the tactics they used. But we talk about there's a grand scheme of things of some of the rivalries they had, just generally speaking. It's definitely an overall top 5 all-time pound-for-pound rivalry. I mean, the kingpin is always going to be Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Nothing's going to top Ali Frazier ever. No matter how hard you try it, nothing's going to top it. Muhammad Ali and Ken Norton, not like Ali Frazier, but it was pretty darn good. The 3-fight series between Evander Holyfield and Riddick Bowe rivaled Ali Frazier in the 90s. It had every bit what Ali Frazier had in the ring in their trilogy in the 70s. And we talk about some of the lighter weight classes at the time. Tony Zeo, Rocky Graziano, a face-first, bash you upside the head, break your face every single which way possible rivalry. That's how both guys just knocked down numerous times and just had teeth shattered numerous times. And in their 3-fight series of 46, 47, and 48, 3 dramatic fights, and 46 and 47, the Ring Magazine Fights of the Year. That was your in-your-face, bash you upside the head type rivalry. We talk about Tony Zeo and Rocky Graziano. Of course, Sugar Ray Robinson had 2 of them. One of them against Gene Fullmer, who pushed Robinson to the limits. Actually won the series against Robinson 2-1-1. That was up there. And everything Robinson did in 2 of Fulmer's wins, Fulmer just kept at him. And that's why he had the success against Robinson. That's up there. Is also a great rivalry. Maybe we're not putting Robinson as an all-time great without that, because Gene Fullmer made Sugar Ray Robinson have to dig deep and go to the well. And we spin it off, of course, with Robinson. Later on, his rivalry with Jake LaMotta, one of the staples of boxing rivalries south of the heavyweight division. Maybe you could probably say the premier rivalry south of the heavyweight division all time. We talk about how they went at it. Of course, LaMotta got the win in the second fight, but Robinson controlled that 5-1. But 5 of the 6 fights, Robinson got all he could bargain for and then some from the tough and durable Jake LaMotta, till the 6th fight, forever known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where Robinson just gave him the beating of his life. So that was a rivalry, probably the staple rivalry south of the heavyweight division. Some of the other ones in here, I mean, go way back, Sam Langford versus Harry Willis. We can talk about many things with Sam Langford, probably the greatest fighter to have never won a world title. Probably say greatest fighter to never win a title, get a title shot. Reasons I won't use my platform for. I'm sure the fight followers could figure that out. And that was a heck of a rivalry between 2 guys who just delivered the goods and looking to put their mark in history. And they were a match made for one another. That was Sam Langford versus Harry Willis. Among some of the others, now as you go south to the territory of Pep-Saddler, Barney Ross versus Jimmy McLaurin. Barney Ross, a top 15 all-time great pound for pound. But McLaurin had to make him earn it. And in the span of a year, they each flipped the world lightweight title. And you're talking about 2 fights where it had 2 instant classics. And especially this second one, which was the 1934 fight of the year. And after being dropped, Ross answered the call. McLaurin got Ross again. But Ross, in the 3rd fight, got back to Jimmy McLaurin to regain that championship and establish himself as one of the premier fighters of that time. One of the first multi-division winners in boxing history. We talk about winning multiple division titles. Barney Ross was the first, although one of the divisions he won it wasn't even recognized, so they didn't give him credit for that. But that was the success of Barney Ross. But his rivalry with Jimmy McLaurin was as good as anyone, because they flipped that series a few times themselves. And you talk about some of the other ones, of course, you go back, there you go south to the lighter weight classes. Roberto Duran versus Esteban de Jesus. And Esteban de Jesus, in the first 2 fights against Duran, gave him everything he could handle, floored him twice in the first 2 fights, won the first fight, didn't win the title because of weight contracts, gave Duran all he can handle the second fight before Duran beat him, and did all he could in the 3rd fight against Duran, till Duran just pasted him in probably Roberto Duran's finest hour. Duran de Jesus was one of the great all-time little big men rivalries. And some of the others, of course, if we go a little more modern, Eric Morales versus Marco Antonio Barrera in the roughly the same weight class, fighting for the post Julio Cesar Chavez era for Mexican supremacy. talk about two guys that were made for one another. That's what you had with this trilogy. And face first, let it go. That's what this trilogy was, especially the first fight, which was the 2000 fight of the year. And round 5 was the round of the year for 2000. We talk about Morales and Barrera. Of course, you go a little bit more modern. Manny Pacquiao against Juan Manuel Marquez. And prolonged a little too long because of business. But still, the 4 times they fought, it was a match made heaven because it was evenly matched until the 4th fight when Marquez said, "The heck with it, I'm going for the knockout," and pasted Manny Pacquiao face first to end that rivalry. But people will tell you, you can make a case that Marquez won at least 2 fights despite the official result because of boxing business. He was victimized by boxing politics. So Pacquiao Marquez, also a little big man rivalry. Let's go back to the early 90s. Let's go even further south, the flyweight division. How about Michael Carbajal versus Humberto Chiquita Gonzalez? Made for one another, and they talk about the supremacy of that weight class. The lightest division to dose over $1 million in gates, and that's what this first fight did at the Las Vegas Hilton in '93. That saw Gonzalez has beat Carbajal up, floor him twice. Looked like he's going to be on a way to a knockout until Carbajal came off the canvas and beat up Humberto Chiquita Gonzalez to unify 2/3 of the flyweight championship at 108 pounds. And Michael Carbajal became a box office hit after that point. Probably, if I'm correct, the largest the money-making fighter in those weight classes ever. Also, at that point, the lightest fighter to ever dose more than $1 million at live gates and on fight purses. And he certainly was a heck of a moneymaker because when you saw Michael Carbajal in action, you got the action. And that rivalry he had with Humberto Chiquita Gonzalez certainly filled that. And they were made for one another in 3 epic fights in that trilogy. Ricardo Lopez versus Rosendo Alvarez. Ricardo Lopez, probably the greatest to ever fight in those weight classes. But the 2-fight series, Rosendo Alvarez, a tough fighter from Latin America, gave Lopez everything he could handle, including flooring him in the first fight. And some thought Alvarez should have been given the decision in the first fight against Lopez. But Lopez, showing how great he was, buckled down, got the rematch, and got the win, and more convincingly. But again, Alvarez gave Lopez everything he can handle in that 2-fight series. And who can forget, if you go back to 2005, Diego Corrales versus Jose Luis Castillo. And the first fight, probably a case for the greatest pure single bout in boxing history. At least it's the fight of the 21st century, because that's what Corrales Castillo won was. Give and take both ways. And of course, the second fight, Castillo battered Corrales. And the third fight didn't happen for business reasons. But that first fight between Corrales and Castillo, arguably the greatest fight ever, and it has a strong case for that distinction. But it certainly was the fight of the 21st century. That certainly was a rivalry. And we talk about Diego Corrales, his rivalry with Joel Casamayor, the standout out of Cuba. Interesting trilogy between them, where Corrales wins the first, Casamayor wins the other 2. And also a great rivalry there, because it was all about, for that trilogy, whether or not Joel Casamayor could get to that next level, and if Diego Corrales could pick himself up after the loss of Floyd Mayweather and the tough fight with Jose Luis Castillo. And even though he did the best he could, Joel Casamayor won that series, but it was a pretty darn good 3-fight series between those two. What a rivalry that was in the early 2000s. So now those southern weight classes, Roberto Duran versus Ken Buchanan. I mean, Roberto Duran doesn't get to this point without fighting Ken Buchanan. And we know what happened halfway through the fight. The uppercut that landed right in that area where Ken Buchanan can no longer produce kids. And that was the end of that one. But Duran Buchanan was a good one. We're not talking about Roberto Duran's run as a lightweight. We're not talking about his fights with Ken Buchanan and that trilogy with Esteban de Jesus. And Roberto Duran needed those to put himself in the upper echelon of all-time greats. Many rivalries in those weight classes, and right there with it was Willie Pep and Sandy Saddler. And Pep-Saddler, it was 3-1 Saddler, but maybe the one win by Pep was just as big as the other three to put Pep at a stature he needed to be put in, and that's why he got to that point, especially after what took place a year and a half before with the airplane accident, because everybody thought he was never going to be the same again, but he buckled down for one last great performance. Now, to close it out, we talk about their place in featherweight history, and it's who's who in that division. You could probably argue that Willie Pep and Sandy Saddler might be the two greatest featherweights of all time. It's a strong, strong case for it. I mean, the background speaks for itself. I mean, Willie Pep is probably going to get the nod. Of course, Saddler won that series 3-1, but due to the career and overall body of work of Willie Pep, he more than likely gets the nod due to it. And the one win he had over Saddler just was as big as the 3 wins Saddler had. So maybe that's where it tips toward Pep's favor as the number one featherweight of all time. And you can probably argue Saddler's not far behind it. And in those weight classes, in that weight class, it's a who's who. Because you talk about some of the old school 8, you throw some extra names in there, it'll really look real good. Especially when we talk about a couple of guys immediately behind them. We're talking about Henry Armstrong, the guy who won world titles in 3 weight classes simultaneously. Started his run as a featherweight. He's not far behind them. He's there. Of course, Salvador Sanchez out of Mexico. Unfortunate tragedy. But was trending upward. We talk about the last few fights of his career. Danny Little, Red Lopez, Juan Laporte, Wilfredo Gomez, and Pat Caldwell, and Azuma Nelson, just name a few of them. He's in that conversation. Of course, Alexis Arguello, before his runs at super featherweight and lightweight, had a great run of featherweight, just as great as anyone. He's certainly up there. Kid Chocolate out of Cuba, first ever Cuban world champion. Great run himself. Big ones, or especially a guy like Benny Bass, where he handled him in the 3 of the 4 fight series. But there, Kid Chocolate is up there. Johnny Dundee's up there. Go way back to a guy like Abe Attell. And if Abe Attell is one of the real interesting stories way back. This is even before Pep and Saddler. Abe Attell, one of the clever geniuses of the ring. And we talk about ring generalship. That was Abe Attell. He told us some of the wins he had over guys like George Dixon and Battling Nelson. He up there was a part of that great run in that weight class. Certainly a top 10 all-time great featherweight. And his story is a must-read. It's the middle of the Black Sox scandal. After that, a lot of wild things happened to him. But it doesn't turn the fact the guy's a top 10 all-time great featherweight. That's Abe Attell. And some of the other ones I'm going to throw in, maybe more some of the modern ones. Of course, as I said, Juan Manuel Marquez, Marco Antonio Barrera, especially Barrera after he beat Hamed and got the second win over Eric Morales. That put him up there in featherweight history. Eric Morales, you could probably say, is up there. A list of several others. Go back to guys like Terry McGovern and George Dixon, as I mentioned. But maybe the top 5 is probably edge and stone. When you talk about Willie Pep, Sandy Saddler, Henry Armstrong, Salvador Sanchez, and Alexis Arguello. Some other names up there, but those are probably the Fab 5 of that weight class. And you could probably argue that because of the epic 4-fight series, the top 2 spots belong to Willie Pep and Sandy Saddler. And I'm not going to argue Armstrong. I'm not going to argue Sanchez. I'm certainly going to argue Arguello because all 3 are worthy of it. But they probably have the distinction of the top 2 greatest featherweights to ever fight in that weight class. And it was 77 years ago tonight at Madison Square Garden in front of packed 20,000 fans, which was a record at the time for a fight in that weight class. After losing by knockout in the first fight and basically being written off, the Will of the Wisp, Willie Pep, comes out of the woodworks to put together his last great performance when he used the ring, utilized a jab and effective counterpunching to hold off a hard-charging Sandy Saddler by unanimous decision to win the World Featherweight Championship and to put himself among the ultra-elite all-time greats forever immortalized, the great Willie Pep. An epic 4-fight series. Some interesting stories. And if some stories in that featherweight division all time, I would recommend you guys to read if you have 5 minutes to spare. I'm not talking about the names I mentioned. Some of the other ones also, they're like Abe Attell, Terry McGovern, George Dixon. Just name several of them. Johnny Dundee's up there also. And you probably throw a few others up there. But the featherweight division has probably a deeper in rich history than the naked eye would say. We talk about way back at the upper five. And some of the ones after that, you can go a lot of places with it. But it's much deeper in talent than you think, because it's a crux of fighters who come through, and before they pass on to bigger pastures and bigger weight classes, they want to establish their history in that weight class, one of the real original 8. When you talk about the original 8 in weight classes, that was what you had when you talk about the featherweight division and its deep, rich in history, and some all-time great fights in those weight classes, and some ultra elite. We talk about some of the ones I mentioned, and some big events in those weight classes, especially the second fight with Pep-Saddler, as I mentioned. And you can fast forward a while to 1980 when you talk about the fight between Salvador Sanchez and Wilfredo Gomez, which was a Mexican-Puerto Rican salsa hit. The featherweight division was a bigger hit sensation, and it's deeper in its history and its roots to its core than you could ever dream of. And because of it, that was why, when you look at it, you're going to find more than you think, individually and collectively. And maybe the king of the crop of that division was none other than the Will of the Wisp, Willie Pep. And it was 77 years ago tonight, against all odds, where everyone's calling for him to retire, especially after the plane accident and getting knocked out by Sandy Saddler in the first fight. Comes out of the woodworks, comes out of retirement, comes out of whatever you want to say, and just handles Sandy Saddler to win the unanimous decision and to be forever immortalized. May God forever rest the souls of Willie Pep and Sandy Saddler, arguably the two greatest featherweights to ever lace them up. And a deep, deep division, deeper than even the casual and even the hardcore fight fans think. I could talk about featherweights all I want. I could talk more about this of all I want. I'll do that more often. Now that the NFL season is done, I could do this a little bit more. So more boxing content coming your way of the all-time route, I guess. I'll just take it from here. And on that note, that will wrap up this edition of All Era Sports with Sirhan. Tomorrow night, I relive an epic beating like none other, but it's an epic beating that has its own place in history and escalated a stature of one of the premier greats to a stature that will never be reached. I'll bring that up tomorrow night. As always, if you missed this show or any others in the past, you can catch them on the iHeartRadio and the Apple apps. If you have Apple Podcasts and iHeartRadio on your mobile devices, especially for the iPhone users. If you're watching the video and you want to watch the replay again and see what these fight gloves look like, you can watch them on the X platform, the Facebook platform, as well as the Spotify apps. And as always, make self-care your number one priority in all walks of life. Always take care of yourself first. Always respect other people's boundaries. And more importantly, always set strong boundaries for yourself, and other good things will come your way. It's important you set healthy boundaries for yourself and not let anyone walk all over you. Because if you don't set healthy boundaries and you let people walk all over you, nothing else is going to matter, because that's a part of self-care. Always setting healthy boundaries. And on that note, have a good rest of the night. Take care of yourselves. God bless. And I will see you tomorrow night.